Unan 87.9 FM. Rejoice, refresh, renew, and reflect. Join us for an hour of music that uplifts the soul. Listen to your favorite Jesuit music ministry artists. This is JMM Radio. JMM Radio. Get your day's dose of inspirational music. Tune in to JMM Radio every Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. Only here on Radyo-Katipunan 87.9 FM.
Get your
Every
day's
Wednesday
dose of
from 1 to
music
2
for the
p.m.
soul.
Only
Listen to the
here
music,
on
ACS,
Radyo-Katipunan
Bukas palad, hangad,
FM Radio.
musika fiesta,
Every
and
Wednesday
many more.
from 1 to 2
Click on
p.m.
this link to
Only
learn
here
more.
on Radyo-Katipunan 87.9 FM.
Get your
Every
day's
Wednesday
dose of
from 1 to
music
2
for the
p.m.
soul.
Only here on Radyo-Katipunan
Bukas palad, hangad,
FM Radio.
musika fiesta,
Every
and
Wednesday
many more.
from 1 to
Click
2
on
p.m.
this link to
Only
learn
here,
more.
Father J. Boy Gonzales at Father
Here
Lopez on
on
Radyo-Katipunan.
Bukas palad,
Father Kali Llamado ng Manila Cathedral at Binibining Risa Singson Kaupeng ng Light of Jesus Community dito sa Kapit Pandasal sa Radyo Katipunan 87.9 FM. Radyo Katipunan. News, insights, inspiration. Radyo Katipunan. Down from the hill and down to the world. Radyo Katipunan. The voice of the Blue Eagle. Tara na't simulan ng inyong umaga sa mga magagandang refleksyon tungkol sa ating buhay at pananampalataya. Kasama sina Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle ng Manila, Father J. Boy Gonzales at Father Nono Alfonso ng Kapisanan ni Jesus, Father Kali Llamado ng Manila Cathedral at Binibining Risa Singson Kaupeng ng Light of Jesus Community dito sa Kapit Pandasal sa Radyo Katipunan 87.9 FM.
Maligayang Pasko po ng muling pagkabuhay ni Jesus. Happy Easter to one and all. Halina po at magkapet pandasal tayo. Ito po si Father Nono. Pinagdiriwang na nga po natin ngayon ang muling pagkabuhay ni Jesus. Pero may isang mahiwagang tanong po ang mga scholar. Bakit nga ba, nung muli nang nabuhay si Jesus, bakit di siya nagpakita sa lahat? Piling-pili lang ang pinakitaan niya, mga alagad at tagasunod niya lamang. Bakit nga ba di siya nagpakita sa mga Hudyo, sa mga Romano, sa mga kaaway niya para makita nila na nagkamali sila ukol kay Jesus? Totoo pa lang siya ay Diyos at Panginoon, tulad nga ng pahayag ni Tomas nang makita niya na ito. Kumbaga, sabi nga ng mga kabataan ngayon, sana nagkaroon na lamang si Jesus ng isang big reveal para maniwala lahat ng tao. Bakit kasi exclusive lang, piling-pili at patago pa ang pagpapakita ni Jesus na muli nang nabuhay? Maraming paliwanag pero sa ganang akin, simple lang po. Gusto ni Jesus na magpakita sa bawat isa sa atin. Kung isang big reveal, edi tapos na ang kwento. Wala ka nang dapat gawin kundi maniwala na lamang. Tulad ng katotohanan ang araw ay sumisikat sa umaga at lumulubog sa hapon. Pero ang gusto ni Jesus isang relasyon, relationship, ugnayan. Ang gusto ni Jesus, magpakita siya sa bawat isa sa atin upang maging personal siya sa atin. Nagpakita siya sa mga alagad, oo. Pero nagpakita rin siya kay San Pablo, sa marami pa sa kasaysayan ng mundo. At sa bawat isa sa atin. Sa iyong pagkamulat sa katotohanan, sa pagsibol ng pag-asa sa puso mo, sa nag-aalab na pagmamahal sa iyong kapwa, nararanasan mo si Jesus na muli nang nabuhay. Opo, muli nang nabuhay si Jesus at personal na nagpapakita sa bawat isa sa atin. Amen.
Mamangha sa lalim at ganda ng ating kultura at diwang makabayan sa mga salita at pahina. Sa tulong ng mga guro at manunulat ng panitikang Pilipino, halina't tuklasin ang yaman ng ating panitikan, ang pamana ng ating lahi. Kasama si Binibining Andrea Trinidad, Ginoong Alvin Yapan at Ginoong Gary De Viles ng Kagawaran ng Filipino ng Pamantasang Ateneo de Manila. Ito ang Sari-Sari.
We now listen to the third and last speaker for this webinar. Ferdinand Lopez is a doctoral student at the Women and Gender Studies Institute of the University of Toronto. She received the 2018 Connote Bursary as an international scholar. Born and raised in Tondo, Manila, Ferdy writes about intersections of space, sexuality, and spectacle with Tondo as locus of study. Her other research interests include Philippine-X migrant literature, Philippine culture-based education, and trans-Pacific queer studies. Ferdy was an associate professor in literature and the humanities for 3 decades at the University of Santo Tomas, the Royal Pontifical and Catholic University in the Philippines. Ferdy? You're on mute, Ferdy. I think you have to.
Yeah. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Let me thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to share my review of the film City After Dark in this forum on film and fascism. So I'd like to share my slides. So the title of my presentation is Decadent Desire and Darkness, Performing Kabaklaan in Ishmael Bernal's City After Dark. So let me foreground my talk this morning with 3 different quotes. One coming from Elizabeth Gross, who said, "The city is of the crucial factor in the social production of sex corporeality. It is a built environment that provides the context and coordinates for contemporary forms of the body, a condition and a milieu in which corporeality is socially, sexually, and discursively produced." Next came from Saidiya Hartman, who said, "In the slums, everything is in short supply except sensation. The experience is too much. The terrible beauty is more than one could ever hope to assimilate, order, and explain." In writing this account of the wayward, I have made use of a vast archival materials to represent the everyday experiences and restless characters of life in the city. And the last came from Alan Sinfield, who said, "History is what hurts. It is what refuses desire and set inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis." In ang pelikula sa pelikulang sa lipunang Filipino and ang lipunang Filipino sa pelikula, national artist Bienvenido Lombera prefaced his argument on the interface of art and life by invoking 2 film metaphors, mga aninong gumagalaw, roughly translated as moving shadows, and sa pinilakang tabing or on silver screen, which exhort the nature and modality of filmic representations. He posited that people, places, and events unfolding in the big screen are silhouettes of strangely familiar realities refracted through the director's optical unconscious and power optics. What I propose to do in this paper is to read the filmic representations of gay Manila during the martial law regime using Ishmael Bernal's City After Dark, a celluloid cartogram exposing queer spaces in the film. Further, I will compare the images of Manila with anecdotal recollections of 15 bakla, all Tondo denizens who queered the city of man during the turbulent years of the Marcos regime. Bernal's dark and decadent Manila is one of the many representations of the noble and ever-loyal city as a metropolis enveloped in darkness, which I argue is a metaphor of an abject nation, economically and spiritually impoverished. Nighttime exposes the lives of these urban settlers whose motives and actions are hidden in darkness. Night vitalizes its own inhabitants. The Marcos regime has created a nation of nocturnal beings, prostitutes, drug dependents, pimps, queers, and disabled people, all trying to survive the economic squalor and moral putrescence of the Sin City. As a metonymic representation of the nation, Manila is populated by marginalized subjects whose lives transect with the gay fashion designer Manay Sharon and her bakla cohorts through a vicious cycle of lust, manipulation, and betrayal. Meanwhile, the bakla, perceived in folk and popular imagination as a nocturnal blood-sucking creature, cruise and queer the asphalt jungle as night settles in, together with other shadowy shapeshifters of Philippine social realities. In the regime of blood and beauty, the conjugal dictators, Ferdinand and Imelda, are the arch-impaler, paternal and maternal bloodsuckers who drain the national coffers, the lifeblood of the nation, sap the life force of the people, living in the state of terror and horror. They live in the wake of their feeding frenzy, heaps of tortured body and dead bodies, scores of national debt, throngs of economically depraved and culturally displaced citizens emulated in the altar of totalitarianism. Heuristically, I will deploy the terms bakla, gay, transgender, and queer interchangeably in this study, both for strategic reason and practical purposes, notwithstanding the specific originary, translation slippage, categorical conflation, and their overdetermined formation. Bakla is a capacious term signifying a broad spectrum of non-normative sexuality. The self-reference of most gay men in the Philippines is bakla, which my respondents believe is the English translation of the term. Meanwhile, queer connotes multiple antagonisms with institutions of power. It becomes synonymous with the bakla when it is made to represent the subversive and disruptive potentials of this signifier, inasmuch as the bakla as a gender category shares with queer a long history of persecution and suffering in relation to institutions of power and hegemonic structures. The sexualization of space, indicative of contemporaneous contestations by gendered subjects, is poignantly explored in Betsky's Queer Space, Architecture and Same-Sex Desire. Betsy argues that spaces are ritualized and transformed by the experiences of people occupying a given locale. Although not mutually exclusive, these queer spaces are activated by the bakla who unashamedly and unabashedly perform their kabaklaan in specific locus and in particular moment. In defining queer space, Betsky emphasized that, and I quote, "Queer space is a kind of space that I find liberating, amoral, and sensual. Space that lives only in and for experience. It melded utopian and corporeal escape, a movement inward and with a movement outward. The city was rewritten by men cruising and refusing to accept strictures. In all these ways, queers queered the city. They made it their own. They opened it up on the margins and they performed it." End of quote. It is by sheer presence of the sexualized subject that the given space assumed its gender and sexual identity. In queer geography, the transgressive sexuality of the bakla is scripted in the grammar of time, rehearsing performative identity in the spatial rhetoric of the city. The recalcitrant nature of the bakla thrives in and partakes of this democratic counterculture of queer politics and carnivalesque presence. The conventional representation of space as a historical, asexual, and immobile locus of cultural contestations remain problematic in the light of how the tripartite connectedness of time, place, and ideology inform both individual and collective identities through a complex webwork of social relations and exchange. These leave spaces in the film City After Dark and place decadent desire through associative connections and visual semiotics in the film's mise-en-scene. In writing A History of Difference, Joan Scott explains how narratives of alterity challenges the prevailing notions of gender and how it presents a world of alternative sexualities that subvert the hegemonic constructions of the social world. Scott proposes the documentation of the lives of those overlooked and omitted in the accounts of the past because it occasions a crisis in traditional historiography. In postmodern retelling, installing historical context to filmic images is significant because it critically engages the social institutions and social structures of the past by examining the forms of administrative control, surveillance, and social regulations. In this paper, the filmic representations of kabaklaan in Ishmael Bernal's City After Dark focuses on darkness as trope, which ironically renders visible the decadent desires of a nation under the throes of fascism. The gentrification of Manila, a salutary aftermath of Imelda Marcos's visionary City of Ban, or more properly, City of BAM, project is a cornerstone of the Marcosian New Society. As a beautifully dressed window, this historical capital showcases Imeldific excesses and delusional aesthetics, where the city is aggressively purged of lawless elements using military might and strategically purified of economic putrescence and squalor by invoking the use and abuse of artistic license and creative power to build edifices that memorializes the new political order. Concomitant to this, throngs of urban poor settlers are periodically displaced while the rest of shantytown are purposely enveloped in pristine white walls that palisades the pestering eyesores of the city. No wonder why the self-instituted patroness of Philippine arts, the governor of Metro Manila, the Human Settlement Commissioner, and the First Lady of the Republic of the Philippines, Madam Imelda Romualdez Marcos, endowed with a string of political epithets, emblematic of unbridled authority, successfully persuaded the producers of Ishmael Bernal film Manila by Night to change the movie title to City After Dark in 1980, obliterating all allusions to the decadent center of Philippine political and cultural life during the martial law era. The city film Manila by Night constructs this geopolitical entity not merely as a place of action, but as a living catalyst and pivotal agent that engage and steer the other characters to personally and communally respond to life's constant clobbering in the metropolis. The film successfully presents multiple narratives that are structurally suspended on a peg. The 7 narratives gravitate around the central intelligence gay character, Manay Sharon, a fashion designer, perhaps modeled after the late popular fashion iconoclast Santiago de Manila or Ernest Santiago, couturier Baday, operator of Coco Banana Disco Bar by Night, where Manila's who's who in politics, arts, and entertainment gather in the company of Manila's outlandish drag performers. In the film, Manay Sharon is the embodiment of the city in queer quest for meaning in life and love. Inextricably linked in the life of Manay are 2 opportunistic men, Pebrero, a taxi driver who has a utilitarian relationship with Adelina, a female prostitute disguised as a nurse, and Baby, an innocent provincial lass whom he impregnates and abandons afterward. The other lover is Alex, the wayward son of Virgie, an obsessive-compulsive reformed prostitute who tries to build a perfect family, but who ironically created a dysfunctional family at the brink of disintegration. Alex has a romantic entanglement with Vanessa, a student from an exclusive girls' school, whom he forsakes for drugs, and Bea, the blind masseuse to whom Alex had a sexual encounter with, at the instigation of Kano, the lesbian drug pusher, whose love interest is none other than the blind Bea. These motley characters inhabit the temporal spaces of City After Dark. As living dead, they roam the city in search of their next victim, someone who will feed their thirst and hunger for love, understanding, and acceptance, but who would instead attract those who mirrors the same appetite and similar aspiration. Manila is a city that never sleeps because darkness awakens manifold impulses and longings in her. These nocturnal beings are portrayed alive, negotiating dark alleys, discotheques, gay bars, congested apartments, and brothels in the asphyxiated streets of Binondo, Paco, Blumentritt, Sampaloc, and Ermita in the Sin City. At the heart of the city is Manay, sister to an extended family relation defined more by sexual proclivities and sympathetic filiations. Manay Sharon is a do-goober who tries to help the blind Bea regain her sight, provides the need for her boyfriends Pebrero and Alex, and try to recover the dead body of Adelina, Pebrero's mistress, who was strangulated by an irate sex partner. This does not mean that Bernal is cashing on the good, funny, hysterical gay stereotype, because in the film, Bernal managed to show the underside of her character as cynical, promiscuous, and gullible. According to Dr. Bienvenido Lambera, Manay Sharon is the first gay character in Philippine cinema who is not a caricature. Bernal's sympathetic portrayal of Manay Sharon subtends kabaklaan, rehearsing Bernal's own identificatory sexual politics. His deep psychological probing of the complexity of gayness, coupled with his existential search of meaning in queer quotidian existence, is a manifestation of his philosophical insights, political conviction, and aesthetic moorings. As opposed to the other desperate and depraved characters in Bernal's dark city, sinking in the quagmire of despair and anguish, and using love and sex as a way to escape from their dystopic locations, Manay Sharon is the only character who finds redemption by embracing her existential isolation, queer frivolity, and Catholic reality. Manay plumbs the depth of being in order to reconcile spirituality and sexuality. At the end of the film, she enshrines the image of the Santo Niño, the iconic representation of gender fluidity, in her atelier abode. The venerated image of popular devotion has been transformed to a queer religious icon, as Neil Garcia points out, a sacred plating garbed in satin, lace, lame, accented with glass beads, rhinestones, ostrich feathers, and garish accoutrements. In Tondo, Manila's poorest district, the image of the conquistador prince, the Santo Niño, is enshrined amidst economic declension and moral degradation. It is in this poverty-stricken neighborhood where the most lavish and grandest fiesta celebration in the country is held every third Sunday in January, and where the most carnivalesque fiesta procession are routed, showcasing the flamboyant articulations of kabaklaan. In this Bactinian revelry, the most spectacular expressions of the bakla body is repossessed from the consumptive male gaze through its double positivity, as medium conveying the inversion and also as performative vehicle of heteroglossic projection, which evades the heterosexist imagination. In the film, A similar Bakhtinian impulse is echoed in the statement, "Sino ang Diyos ngayon? Who is God tonight? Or who wants to join me?" uttered by a gay character wearing the toga of a Roman emperor, or of Bacchus, the god of wine and merrymaking. Perhaps a parody in form and substance to the despotic president, drunk with power and military might. As God to his comrades, this bakla appropriates the character of a Roman ruler and challenges the unbridled power of the Filipino Bacchus residing in Malacanang Palace, inaugurating and presiding over the longest bacchanalia, the political economy of sex tourism in Philippine history. In addition, this bakla, who together with his cronies of drunk and drug cross-dressers, lesbian pimp and pusher, and other drug dependents invade the breakwaters of the Manila Bay on New Year's Eve, a symbolic baptism to the degenerating body polity of the new society. This rite to buffoonery permits the resurgence of inverted folk wisdom that allows people to see the carnivalesque world with foolish eyes, exacerbated by hallucinogens, alcohol, and nicotine ingestion, amplified by the camera's slow-motion, surreal images of floating candles, colorful firework display, an alienating night sky, the murky water of desolation, and a land engulfed by a sense of void, have been dramatically intensified by the vanishing tribe's psychedelic sounds. The coarseness and grotesqueness of this orgiastic merrymaking affirms the indestructible character of these moral dregs of society amidst the ephemeral regime of military authority and truth. The recalcitrant nature of the bakla partakes of this rhetoric of democratization and counterculture, which Mikhail Bakhtin calls the carnival. He explains, and I quote, "In the world of the carnival, and all hierarchies are cancelled, all castes and ages are equal, all the elements, the peculiar festive character without any piousness, complete liberation from seriousness, the atmosphere of equality, freedom, and familiarity, the symbolic meaning of indecencies, the colonial crowning and uncrowning, all of these are contained in the carnivalesque world, and they all have the same philosophic meaning." End of quote. In the film, the bakla rewrite the heteronormative scripts of the discotheque, folk houses, parks, comfort rooms, or street that serves as cruising areas, refusing restrictions and resisting surveillance. Relatedly, la mierda, or cruising, and the mujeran, drag balls, are types of wayward informalities that initiates the aesthetic refunctioning and cultural reclaiming of the streets of Manila as analog of queer informality and wayward urbanism of Manila, the city of contradictions. Here I provisionally use the term la mierda as a form of tracing, a methodology suggesting the multiple ways of producing knowledge on the bakla, as both tragic and triumphant figuration of persistent individual and resilient communities. By tracing roots, routes, rites, and rituals of kabaklaan, which is pagtunton, which is also pagtalunton, I reclaim the invisible, silence, and erased spaces of kabaklaan in the genealogy of Philippine queer making, and remap the forgotten and elided bakla in the archives of community history, queer sexuality, and urban planning. La mierda, as tracing, is also a conscious retrieval of the archipelagic bakla and repossession of the erotics of queer remembering in order to uncover the persistent violence on queer lives and multiple ways in which the bakla cope with precarity. It recovers the ephemeral practices of kabaklaan in the annals of the everyday history, culture, and geography. Another interesting aspect of the film City of After Dark is the moheran, or the gay ball. In this scene, Alex and his friends poke fun at a disabled partygoer while waiting for the drug courier Kano to come back with their purchase. Lilay Magalona is a tondo bakla who lip-syncs Madonna's Like a Virgin and Material Girl. She was born with kyphosis or hump on her back. Through her, Bernal yoked transness and disability as modalities of intersectional disenfranchisements under an ableist fascist regime. Usually held on streets blocked off from traffic and basketball courts, the Mujeran is participated by the bakla of all ages, forms, and sizes. This Spanish loanword mujer, girl, woman, implicates the psychosexual inversion of the bakla, where femaleness becomes a deep-seated yearning. As a social event, the gay ball is participated by young gay initiates who performs the rite of passing in this queer community. Intergenerational gaps are bridged by the Mujeran as the young initiates are welcomed by their gay sisters, mothers, aunts, and godmothers to the challenging world of kabaklaan. This ritualistic community building is necessary in ensuring gay survival against the systemic aggression and oppression practices of a heteropatriarchal society. The carnivalesque spirit allows the bakla to perform their kabaklaan in the heterotopic spaces of the Mujeran. In Baktinian terms, what straight men do when they playfully cross-dress or cross gender lines is to produce and emphasize the negative pole of the carnivalesque. That is, for example, that is when the inversion becomes caricature or parody. With the bakla, gender performativity during the Mujeran is the radical ambivalence, so crucial to the subversive and the creative violence, and so delicately sustained and underlined in this very positive performance. During the martial law period, the Mujeran begins at 7 o'clock in the evening and ends at 11:45, 15 minutes before the curfew. When the siren sounds, the bakla amazingly crosses over walls in high-heeled shoes, dexterously roll under parked jeepneys, and miraculously scamper towards the nearest house where they can find temporary refuge. When caught by patrolling members of the Metrocom or the Philippine Constabulary, they are brought to Kramit to diffidently pull weeds in their elegant gowns or repeatedly sing the Philippine national anthem and other popular songs till the wee hours of the morning, or personally minister to their impounding policemen and their cohorts as maid, masseuse, and mistress of sexual pleasures. These mujeristas go home the morning after, a picture of abjection, ravaged, ragged, and exhausted, as the bakla is stripped of the magic and mystery. She becomes an ugly representation of pathetic buffoonery and comic wretchedness through military state discipline. Spaces of struggles and spectacular survivals are located in the theater of everyday life, where this bakla confronts actual personal, economic, and social adversities during the regime of blood, beauty, and brutality. This shared vulnerability and incommensurability of their beautiful existence and wayward lives becomes the avenue for the flourishing of radical hope, a dream, an aspiration to generate positive and productive courses of action amidst the banality of oppression, injustice, and inequality. These queer lives under the constant surveillance and discipline of the military and the religious sector occasion what Ashton Crowley describes as the politics and aesthetics of otherwise, a flight from the present, a refusal of violence, an embracing of the inexhaustible plenitude of possibilities for reparation and justice, and the disruptive performance of, or else, the radical hope. Thus, the courage to live life well amidst life constant clobbering, unavoidable destruction, considerable risk, and inevitable persecutions in the hands of bigots and self-righteous hypocrites. Jose Esteban Muñoz, in talking about then and there, of queer futurity states that queerness, and I quote, queerness is about futurity and hope. That is to say that queerness is always in the horizon. End of quote. It is a touchstone of hopeful anticipation, an astonished contemplation away from the enveloping darkness in life towards the light of justice, equity, and accessibility, a specter of a new and better world to come. These hidden lives of gays have been revealed in the film Manila by Night, exemplified by Manay Sharon and her friends who flamboyantly cruise the streets of Manila. They try to escape the pernicious cycle of despair, depravity, and destitution by forming communities so they can collectively confront homophobia, heteronormativity, heteropatriarchy, and homonationalism. Manila is an insomniac city, a city that never sleeps. It is made up of marginal characters that come out of their closeted existence and cruise the city, mapping and liberated city streets and alleys. It is a night city, queer and colorful as the people that inhabits it. Subverting the light of the city, the queer spaces of the city disappears at the break of dawn as light dissolves these ephemeral spaces of kabaklaan, only to be reborn after the sun has set. As darkness envelopes the city, creatures marginalized and oppressed by the light will once again roam the dark city, kicking and screaming as all fagots do, celebrating their newly recovered voice and newfangled visibility in a patriarchal society that has silenced, condemned, and consigned them to despair and decadent darkness. Thank you at isang mapagpalayang araw sa inyong lahat.
Thank you for that talk, Professor Lopez. Thank you so much to all our panelists. We shall now have our open forum. We have received a question via chat, and the question goes, how are we faring now in terms of the film's project in conscientizing viewers of Duterte's fascism? I guess the question is for any of our panelists to answer.
Maybe I can start. I think for one, because of pandemic, I think in terms of conscientization, I think we're pretty much we're in that part where I think the government is reacting against against the against us. For one, we saw how how Picon the president with BP's the recent spate between President Duterte and BP's and Vice President Lenny Robredo, because of Lenny Robredo's presence in rehabilitation of affected affected places in the Philippines. I think that one can be considered as
something is wrong with the signal of Gary. Maybe Nerissa or Ferdy can opt to answer the question raised in our chat. Unmute.
Hi, okay. Sorry. Yes, thank you, Professor Yapan. I'm sorry, because I have bad Wi-Fi too. The question, can I ask the question to be read again by Andrea, please?
Okay, so the question is, how are we faring now in terms of the film's project in conscientizing viewers of Duterte's fascism?
I see. Great. Yeah, thank you. So the question actually, there's an assumption in the question that the films that we've talked about, I talked about a documentary by a Filipino-American filmmaker, PJ Raval. Um, uh, Dr. De Villas talked about, a Filipina filmmaker, Alex Arumpac's documentary, and our third presenter, Ferdy Lopez, a scholar in University of Toronto. She talked about a film from martial law, right? So Ishmael Bernal's City After Dark. So these are from three different eras, and the three of us, as friends and as scholars who are studying fascism, we do see that these films are meant to bring politics into the consciousness of the viewer. So the question about how are we faring now? I mean, are Filipinos in the Philippines and Filipinos in the diaspora, do they get the politics that is sort of inscribed? It is in the narratives of the films, the two documentaries, and the one narrative film discussed by Ferdy Lopez. And it's a great question. The question is really asking, I think this is how I understood it, are Filipino film goers, film lovers, cineasts, anyone who enjoys watching film about the Philippines, films that have been made by Filipino-American filmmakers, do they understand what is happening now in the country? I don't have a definite answer for that question. I can answer it in terms of the project of the filmmaker that I talked about, who is PJ Raval. I think that the fact that you have a Filipino-American like Raval trying to tie two historical strands in Philippine life, no? And I sort of want to encompass not just, when I say Philippine life, I don't mean just Filipinos in the Philippines, but even Filipino immigrants like myself, So I think that for a Filipino-American to understand how these histories intersect, how the way to understand our current situation is to have a historical imagination, to think about, the connection between the past and the present. I think that that's a good thing. I think that gives me hope at this very dark time. So I guess in brief, to answer the question, how are we faring now? Well, if we look at the work of a filmmaker like Raval, who was born and raised in the United States, but gets it, right? He gets that authoritarianism has its roots in colonialism, in the experience of the Philippines as an American colony, that there is this relationship between empire and fascism. I think we're doing okay. I don't know. That's my answer. But I'm sorry I interrupted.
Okay.
Dr. De
My
Villas,
problem
because
with the connection, but I'm
same.
also, I agree, that the fact that the government is relentless in doing a demolition job against BP. I think that's an indication already of that as far as conscientization, we are actually at that level. Okay. And then of course I would say also recently when student actually held the academic strike,
Absolutely.
yeah, and the reason why our talk was moved to to these days because precisely of that. So we acknowledge that. We acknowledge how even the students, in their own sector, in their own level, they're experiencing the brunt. And that's why their call is really against. It's not so much against. It's not really so much about academic requirements, and which is actually part of their demands, but really, accountability, asking the government, to be accountable for, what has happened, with the typhoon and the pandemic, their inefficiency, in all these things. So I would say, that could be considered as a form of, little steps, towards conscientization. Thank you.
As a second question, maybe for Ferdy. Fast forward the discourse of machismo and political authority to the current situation that we have now. I don't know if Ferdy or Nerissa are aware of recent trends now in Philippine politics where we try to, for example, do we glorify or do we pay attention to the likes of the politics of Vico Soto, Isko Moreno, a sort of an alternative to the machismo of President Duterte. It's a new kind of queering, and I'm just wondering how the speakers that we have today can comment on this, can their thoughts on this recent trends in Philippine politics. Is Ferdy okay?
Ferdy here. Yeah, okay, Ferdy.
Yeah. Are you aware of this, Ferdy? Because just this lockdown, I mean, the careers, the political careers of Vico Soto and Yorme had a major political boost in social media because of their young, their poggy, and they seem to be doing all the right things, all the right moves as an alternative to the machismo of President Duterte. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, I managed to keep myself updated with Philippine politics. So there are a lot of publicities and social media presence in terms of these mayors of Pasig and mayor of Manila. So they are really doing a great job in trying to address the specific needs of people in their community. And this will be a queer comparison with what is happening in the country, the kind of neglect, the kind of abandon that is happening, especially in areas that are said to be heavily affected, the slum areas, not only in the metropolis, but outside the metropolis. But again, I would like to always read it against the grain by trying to say that we have to look into motives and intentions and political ambitions. So while it is true that we are trying to admire efforts of these politicians, at the end of the day, they are still politicos, and we have to really, the reason why I talked about the martial law during the time of President Marcos is that we have the benefit of a hindsight. We can look back. At this time, it simply reinforced the continuity of this fascist government that had its root because of the way the president is trying to emulate, the strongman President Marcos. And as far as these young politicians are concerned, so what they are doing is admirable, but still we have to look at the bigger picture in terms of political ambition, in terms of the role of media in trying to pan out all these desirable images. So people will still have to be vigilant. Vigilance is said to be the call of the day, especially during these troubled times. So fascism prosper because people are already beginning to lose the so-called attentiveness to what the government is doing. So the moment we do that, fascism will prosper. So that is why we should always be critical in looking at these everyday forms of struggles in this country.
Maybe Robbie can unmute.
Hi, yeah. Thank you. I wanted to follow up with Ferdy Lopez and her point about how we need to be vigilant. Fascism as a worldview, as an ideology, is built on spectacle. It is built on images. And the question of Professor Yapan is a very important one. We have supposedly alternatives to the current autocrat who is in power in Malacanang. These young, telegenic, mediagenic, possible new heroes. And I want to pause and question that. I think that every time some narrative of a great man rescuing the nation comes up, I get very nervous. Whether he happens to be a handsome son of a former TV host or some young politician from Manila. I think that fascism as an ideology, as a worldview, is a language that is built on images, and we have to be suspicious of images that are sold to us. We have to be suspicious of people who say, you know, I'm the better alternative. Look at me, I'm pretty good looking. I'm the better alternative to the guy right now. I will save the country. I go back to something that an Asian American activist said, Grace Boggs Lee, a radical feminist activist. She said that, you know, we are the heroes. We are the ones we're waiting for. Those of us who believe in inequality, in an alternative to capitalism, in an alternative to capitalism and its violence. We are the ones we're waiting for. We shouldn't think about male leaders who will bring us to the future or to some better present. I think that we always have to be suspicious about images. That's what I'm worried about. Kasi sa Pilipinas, at even in the diaspora, it's always appearance and spectacle and imagery that seduces us there, and so I think that that's why I go back to studying images. The last thing I want to say is, Walter Benjamin, who committed suicide, who is always quoted by people about how he never talked about fascism, but he talked about how politics, when it is reduced to imagery, that's when it is dangerous, and that when it is when politics is reduced to a commodity, something that is sold and marketed and given to people, to make it popular. I think that a thinker like Benjamin, because he knew the reason why he decided to end his life was because the Nazis were knocking on his door. He knew that his time was near. But I also think that, I don't know, this is something I think about when I think about Benjamin's writing. I think that he got really frustrated about the power of spectacles, about the power of imagery. He knew that the reason why the Nazis became, so popular, the National Socialists became popular, was because they knew how to sell an image, the image of a man who would bring, the broken German Republic to its former glory. People were sold on that. They believed him. And I think that, I want us to think about someone like Benjamin, who knew the violence of imagery, and he knew the cost of it when you just believe in it without any questions.
I just would like to add, I do agree that we need to be critical, of all these images, but we also need to pay attention to, to the nuances of how they are being compared. In fact, the state or Duterte is always against, Vico, and for this, he would actually pay up, your men, no, or Isko Moreno, just to ano, no, just to compare, the two, because Vico would, you know, if still in the same mode of populism, in fact, he's also playing that card too, But at the same time, there's a certain nuance, with Vico, At least, for example, relief efforts, instead of naming it naming the goods, the relief goods, after mayors, he would actually just, print, this is your, this came from your taxes, So there's a sense of alternative politics also that Pico is playing. In fact, during the pandemic, he was the one who actually, he came up with certain measures, that go against, the state's, the state's program also. And for that, he was castigated. He was even I think, invited to be, to be investigated and so on and so forth. And then Vico, did not, it's not that he pushed them aside, but he responded to this invitation, to this call, saying that he's doing that because of, he's just performing the mandate of the people, that he wants to do something, at that time, how they can actually cope with the crisis. So again, I agree that we need to be critical, and there's also, seduction in both, in this. But we need also to figure out strategically, how we can actually make use of, of these counter images and counter narratives, or even counter politics, as I said, because if the other one is saying this is war, and they're really trying to co-opt everything, then we must be also equally prepared, to confront it also with certain images, that can generate, more discourses and, more participation, from the viewing public, from us. Okay.
Of course, I raised that question because this is not just happening in the Philippines. This queering of political authority, we can also observe in the careers of the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and France, Emmanuel Macron. But anyway, moving on. Maybe we can entertain one more question from the chat. This one is from Peter Meishi. Do I pronounce it? Do I read it right? He wants the speakers to comment on the apparent absence of the upper class, of the elite, in the documentaries and the film that you discussed this morning. Any thoughts on this? Who wants to go first? I cannot unmute. Maybe
Okay,
Robbie can.
yeah. Here, I got it. Okay. Thank you, Peter Michel. He's a Filipino-American poet, actually, and fiction writer. He asks about class, and I think that we can. Class is at least in Raval's documentary. I think that he didn't mean to do this, but I think that the figure of an elite and privileged life would be the Filipino-American journalist Mary Grace Talusan, Meredith Talusan, and I thought of Talusan as a figure of an immigrant, a privileged Filipino immigrant, you know, and it's an odd pairing because while Talusan is a trans journalist, trans Filipina American journalist, there's a scene in the documentary where when there's a bit of a tension between Talusan's discussion of, you know, the results of the court case when Pemberton was given you know, the judgment by a weak judgment. It was like a slap on the wrist. You know, the Philippine judiciary said that he was going to be sentenced for what is it, 6 to 12 years or something like that. But he would not be serving it in a Philippine jail. He would be serving it in quarters that would be acceptable to the U.S. and the Philippines. And there was a scene where Talusan was having this kind of a spirited discussion with a trans activist, Naomi Fontanos, and I thought it was so, I don't know, it was very cringe-inducing for me because I felt that Fontanos was pushing Talusan to understand that everything that happens in the Philippines is still influenced by the United States and its power in the Philippines. For some reason, Talusan was sort of hesitant to accept that you know, that the power of the United States continues in the life of the Philippine nation, and it shows in the results of the very weak, almost, you know, easy sentence of Pemberton. Of course, in the end, in 2020, Pemberton is free after 6 years. Nothing, you know, he's free. So for me, the class comes, the issue of class, I think economic first world privilege actually is sort of suggested by the figure of a Filipina American trans journalist. But again, I think the question of Mr. Michel is about, you know, like how do we, you know, how do we think about class at a time when in the Philippines the wealthy support Duterte, and the poor are divided. Most Filipinos who are from the, you know, the working class or the working poor, some of them still support Duterte, but I wonder how true that is. You know, I'm very suspicious about surveys. Sorry, I am. I don't know if people on this panel are, but I don't know how to really give credibility to surveys that say that the regime is very popular still with Duterte's base, who were from the working class and the poor. I don't know if that's true, because those who feel the brunt of the violence of the state are from the working class. So, Mr. Michel is asking about class. I think that at least for Raval, he sort of reveals it unintentionally with, you know, a privileged, Harvard-educated Filipina American trans journalist, because that's Talusan. She has an Ivy League education, you know, and has been published in the U.S. and has done very well. And the socioeconomic class of the Laudes I think that's where we see the poor as the subject of violence, of state violence. Thanks for the question, Peter. I'll leave the question to my other peers, Gary and Ferdy.
Thank you. I agree, Nerissa. No. Even with EJK, I mean, the most victims are really are the poor, you know, and so it tends to actually not necessarily excluding other classes, no, okay, but because a lot of EJK victims are really poor, and I think that if there will be, I think there will be there were actually few famous. I mean, there are actually celebrities who were victimized, by Tokhang, but even that, there would be differences, eh. Kasi even when they do Tokhang, to subdivision, they would always, do it in a very, respectful manner, okay. But with, but in the shanties, it will always be, drastic, and harsh, and much harsher. Okay, so I agree that it's not that we are trying to see this as a particularly, just the issue of the of poor people, but there will be issues, other issues that will be more pertinent to different classes. For example, free speech, or ABS-CBN, for example, because they tend to cut costs, so it's not only the working class, but also the managers, and so they would pay up, this, how they were being victimized by the Duterte regime, so it's just so happened that in EJK, I think it's really, the intention was really, to focus on the stories of a lot of poor people, okay, and to a certain extent, it's really clear, that more victims are coming from the poor, and that's it. Thank you.
So in the film that I discussed, City After Dark, so the inhabitants of light are supposed to be the elite classes, and nighttime is best reserved for these people who will never be given the space when there is light. So it is only darkness that they can find the so-called ability to become visible and to be able to articulate their difference from those creatures of the light. And in the film, City After Dark, we find that Manay Sharon represents the middle class. And perhaps this is supposed to be an attempt on the part to awaken a kind of consciousness, especially among the middle class sector of the society, which we find as comprising the bigger sector of Philippine social life, together with those that are said to be belonging to the marginalized, economically marginalized sector. And by trying to awaken in them what is said to be happening in the country, they can take the so-called the kind of position and the experiences that these people who are oppressed, economically deprived, are experiencing, and perhaps collectively foster some kind of an activism against the power of the state.
Okay, and maybe with that one last question, we wrap this webinar. Anne?
Yes, I guess that concludes our session for today. Thank you everyone for this panel. We would also like to thank the following. First, Filipino Department, School of Humanities, Ateneo de Manila, Sari-Sari, radyo-katipunan, 87.9 program, Sir Robbie Reyes, who is here with us today, the PR and Communications Head of the School of Humanities, and of course, the Office of Vice President for the University and Global Relations. Once again, thank you everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our audience.
And one last note, this will be shown on Radio Katipunan as part of the Sari-Sari program. So, abangan niyo pong muli ang mga serye ng aming webinars dito sa Sari-Sari. Magandang umaga at gabi sa inyong lahat.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Mamangha sa lalim at ganda ng ating kultura at diwang makabayan. sa mga salita at pahina. Sa tulong ng mga guro at manunulat ng panitikang Pilipino, halina't tuklasin ang yaman ng ating panitikan, ang pamana ng ating lahi. Kasama si Binibining Andrea Trinidad, Ginoong Alvin Yapan at Ginoong Gary De Viles ng Kagawaran ng Filipino ng Pamantasang Ateneo de Manila. Ito ang Sari-Sari,